I
Yep,
think so.
looks like
All
it.
right. Yeah, so Mayor,
Yes.
whenever you're, very good, very good. Mayor, whenever you're ready.
Sure. Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone. This is Mayor Schulman with the Nonprofit Support Program. It's great to have so many of you with us today. As of this morning, we had almost 200 folks registered for this session. So joining me today are the NSP team. We've got Melanie Tavares, our director, Amy Studwell, our senior NSP officer, and Betsy Johnson and Monica Kelly, our wonderful support team. And as always, a very special thank you to Monica and Betsy, who have been doing all sorts of behind the scenes logistics to make this session happen today. A recording of this session, as well as the handouts, will be available on the COVID-19 resources page of our website by tomorrow, the latest, so you can look for it there. We're happy to offer this webinar free of charge, and there's only one thing that we ask in return, as always, and that is that you complete the survey that you will receive immediately following the webinar. And as always, we really value your thoughts on the session, and we'd love your suggestions on what other programs you're interested in having us offer in the coming months, and also if you've seen any great presenters that you think we should bring here. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Andy Goodman, who's co-founder and director of the Goodman Center in California. And some of you may recognize Andy from the excellent storytelling session he did for us as our spring event a few years back. Andy is very generously offering today's webinar at no cost to all of you or the Hartford Foundation as a way of giving back during the COVID crisis. So Andy, the program is all yours.
Thank you very much, Mayor. And everything we do at the Goodman Center, we do as a team. With me today is my Associate Director, Celia Hoffman. We've been struggling to get the audio ready, but I think it might be working. Celia, are you there on audio? I'm not hearing her. Nope, still not. Okay, well, that's not a problem. Hopefully she'll join in progress. Just a quick description of the logistics today, how to participate to the fullest. First of all the audio connections besides Mayor and me and the other panelists are muted, so we can't hear you, and your video is turned off. That means if you have a question, we'd like you to put it in the Q&A box. Celia, and if Celia can't join us, then Monica will be monitoring the box, and she will relay your questions to me. So if at any point you have a question, just put it in the Q&A box, and it will get to me that way. And this webinar is being recorded. We do that so if you arrive late, leave early, or miss any part, no worries. We will send you a link afterwards so you can go back and watch anything that you missed. And as Mayor mentioned, we have a few handouts for you, one of which is called Key Slides. All the recommendations we make today, any facts or data we'll be sharing with you, and those slides, we will make sure you get a copy of them. So if you want to take notes, great. We don't want to discourage note-taking, but if you're not a note-taker, please know that these are coming your way. And one more thing, if you don't have to rush off at 3 p.m., me and Mayor and Celia will be sticking around to answer any questions we didn't get to. We'll have time for some questions during the actual webinar, but if we don't get to your question, stick around. We'll have after class time starting at 3 o'clock for those who can. And with that, let me get to the agenda and tell you what we're going to cover in a very fast hour this afternoon. We're going to do three things. First, I want to define our terms, because a lot of people now are moving all their activities online and they're calling all of it webinars, but there are really different things happening and they deserve different names so we know what to expect when we're logging in. So we'll define our terms for you first of all and talk about what exactly is a webinar. And then we'll talk about what's going wrong. A lot of people now doing webinars all the time can find them to be boring or annoying or time wasting or all of the above. So what are some of the problems we're experiencing with webinars? And more importantly, how can we do better? We're going to give you some specific recommendations that hopefully from here on in will make your web-based gatherings more engaging, more productive, more enjoyable. Let's start by defining terms. I define a webinar by the original meaning of the word, a contraction of web seminar. Webinars are mostly for information sharing, teaching, or training. You know, they're the virtual equivalent of an in-person workshop or even an academic class. Usually they feature a single speaker like me or a panel of speakers. It's mostly a one-way delivery of information, often supported by slides, but there is room for interaction, whether it's live questions or a chat box or what have you. Now, a lot of you are having web meetings. This is taking your staff meetings, board meetings, department head meetings, and just moving them online. And those are primarily for discussion or decision making. You know, slides may or may not have a role. It may just be a bunch of video streams, you know, in gallery view, as we say on Zoom, where you're seeing a lot of different people at the same time. There is some interaction. There's a lot of interaction, but there may be some document sharing as well. And then there's the webcast. Those are the big ones where there's an audience of hundreds or even thousands. It's the moral equivalent of a keynote speech or an organizational retreat or a conference. Here, it's, again, a much more of a one-way delivery of information, usually with speakers or panels, with less chance of interaction because of the huge number of people participating. Now, we have this as a Venn diagram because there is overlap among these three things. You might be in a hybrid or of one or the other. But for today's purposes, I want you to know we're focusing mostly on webinars when we're using to push information forward for teachings or for trainings, things like that. But if you do mostly web meetings or webcasts, there's still information here for you, so hang in there. So what's going wrong? Why are they often boring or annoying or not engaging, et cetera? Well, there are a few problems, and one of them is sort of the false assumption going in, you know, what's the big deal? You know, we're taking things that we used to do in person, like meetings and trainings, and we're moving it online. So we're seeing the same thing, you know, we used to see in a room. We're all hearing the same thing. The only thing we don't have is eye contact, right? We can't see each other. You know, I'm looking at you, but I can't see you. So a lot of people say, webinar, what's the big deal? It's just a presentation minus eye contact. Well, it is a big deal. Things are pretty different. If we're just talking about moving presentations online, well, we have to acknowledge that most presenters aren't that good to begin with. And this isn't just my opinion. We wrote a book a few years ago called Why Bad Presentations Happen to Good Causes, where we surveyed people like you, and we asked them, we said, when you attend an in-person presentation, you know, what letter grade would you give to the average presentation that you're seeing?
Hey,
take
Andy,
a moment.
Sorry, hate to interrupt. We're seeing video boxes, duplicate video boxes. That issue we had the other day.
How about now?
It's gone now, thanks.
Okay, very good. Thank you for pointing that out. The question is, if you had to give a letter grade to the average presentation you were seeing, what grade would you give? 2,501 people just like you. Take a moment, think about it. What grade would you give? Well, in our survey, people like you said C-. That was the average grade, a C-. So we're starting with subpar work to begin with. And there's another problem. People who are leading webinars haven't been trained. We did this report a few years ago called Dialing In, Logging On, Nodding Off, the true costs of teleconferences, video conferences, and webinars. We'll be sending you a free copy of this report when we're all done. But in it, we surveyed 1,218 people like you, people mostly from nonprofits, but also from government agencies, foundations, et cetera. And we asked them this question. We said, how many of you have been thrust into the role of a webinar leader, but haven't been trained, have had no training in how to do a webinar? What percentage do you think it was? How about 72%? How about 3 out of 4 people leading webinars, responsible for leading people through something like this, no training whatsoever? And then there's the other problem, maybe the biggest of all. It's where do the participants in your webinars live? Now you might think, well, they live in Hartford or Bridgeport or New Haven or wherever, you know? No, they don't. They all live here. Distraction City, population U. And if they're not in Distraction City, they're a few miles down the road in Multitaskville. Because as you well know, and you might be doing it now, the desire to multitask is tremendous when you're particularly in your home, you know, working from there. This is such a problem. I kind of think it's the first problem. We have to solve this problem of participation. How do we keep people engaged throughout a webinar when there's all these distractions and there's such a tendency to multitask? In our report, in the research we did, we asked people about teleconferences, video conferences, and webinars, and look at the common problems ranked by frequency of occurrence, and look how participation is the number 1 or 2 problem in every case. So that's what we're up against. So how can we do better? How can we get people engaged and active and give them a productive, engaging experience? Well, this report, which we did back in 2009, and as you recall, we were coming out of the recession at the time, and for the first time, a lot of nonprofits were experimenting with virtual meetings and trainings and things. Well, we did this report, and at the time, it identified some clear problems and trends with people doing webinars and virtual gatherings of all kinds. Well, in 2009, we also started teaching people how to do this with this webinar on webinars, and we've been doing it for 11 years. And we have conducted literally hundreds of webinars, logging hundreds, if not thousands of hours online, working with people like you, and we've learned an awful lot from them in that time about what works and what doesn't. And so what we have for you today are 5 battle-tested guidelines for more engaging and effective webinars. And that's what we want to share with you today. So here's how we're going to do it. Here's a sneak preview of the 5 guidelines we're going to give you. And what we're going to do is this. I'm going to go through each one in detail, show you some examples of how people are doing it now, and then we'll stop at the end of each one, and I'd like to hear from you. What questions do you have about this guideline? Does it make sense to you? Or if you're already doing it, what things are you doing that we can add to our list so we can all learn from each other? So let's dive right in, and let's start with set expectations. And again, if you have a question or comment, put it in the Q&A box. Celia has connected with us now. That was her voice you heard earlier. So she'll keep an eye on that, and she will relay your questions to me. So set expectations. What I'm talking about here is the first minute or two of the webinar. And what you need to do right up front is be explicit on how to use the platform. You know, right now, people are trying all new things. Some of you may be veterans with Zoom. Some of you may be using it for the first few times. So have a slide or two that lets people know how to turn their lines on and off, show their video, mute, ask questions, deal with technical problems. If you're dealing with an organization that's using the same platform week in and week out, and the same people are using it, after a while, one slide, 15-second review, off you go. But if you're cycling in new people on a regular basis, reaching new audiences, just spend a minute up front letting them know, here's how you participate to the fullest. Generally, we tell people to avoid groups in conference rooms. When we do webinars, sometimes people will say, hey, Andy, we've got 7 people in one organization, all in the same place. Should they all just go in a conference room and watch it that way? And I'll say, well, if you have really superior equipment, like a really big screen on one side of the room so people can see clearly, microphones all around the room so each person can be heard clearly, a nice speaker so they can hear me clearly, well then sure, a conference room can work. Or if we're asking you to work as a team, that we want these 7 people in this one location to occasionally sort of break off and work as a team and then come back, then that makes sense. But in general, the situation that we're all kind of stuck with now, which is basically being by ourselves and having a one-to-one connection, that is the best way to do it. If you have a one connection, if you're wearing a headset, your hands free, you have an internet connection, audio connection, etc., then you will see clearer, be heard clearer, hear me clearer, and you'll feel more literally connected to the experience. And look, anything you can do that keeps people feeling even that much more connected is a good thing in this environment. Another little tip for you is to leave audio connections unmuted with smaller groups, smaller than we have today. I'm talking 25, 20 or fewer. And there's a reason why this works. And here it is. Unmuted audio is the closest thing you have to eye contact. And I know it's true because, as you can see, it's written on the scroll of truth. Now, what do we mean by this? Well, think about your situation now. Because we have so many people here today, we had to mute the lines. And that's sort of one more level of remove between you and me. I can't hear you. And I can't hear you, so you can be in an environment which could get noisy, could get distracting. You can be click-clacking on the keyboard doing other things and I won't hear it. But if we had a smaller group and all the lines were unmuted and you knew that we could hear what's happening where you are, you would make a greater effort to keep things quiet, to eliminate distractions, not to be doing other typing, because I think people generally want to be courteous and show that they're paying attention. So with smaller groups, if you can do this, try leaving the lines unmuted. I think you'll find, again, just a little bit closer connection to the experience for the people on the other end. Now, of course, with larger groups, this is impractical. today we have so many people, it doesn't work. But with smaller groups, give it a try. Prepare people to interact. My experience, and yours may be the same, is I think that with most people, the sort of the culture of webinars is, for the participants, I will sit back, might take notes, might put a question or two in the chat box, but otherwise, I'm here to listen. And you know as well as I do, a good experience is interactive, it's engaging, you're doing stuff. So tell people up front, we're going to be calling on you, we're going to be doing polls, we're going to be doing this, that. Let them know that it's not just sort of sit back and hands off. Get them leaning forward. And put up an agenda. Let them know what's going to happen in order. Here's what we're going to cover today. And I am partial to agendas that reappear throughout the webinar and track progress. Here's an agenda from Get to College. This is midstream in this webinar. If you were to join at this point and see this come up on the screen, you would know that the first 3 sections have been covered. They're in 4 and 5, and you can see the remaining 4 sections yet to be covered. And those bars on the left of the screen there, those tell you that you're in the middle portion of a 3-segment experience. So here's a summary of the tips I just gave you. These are all to be done in the first minute or two to make sure that people feel and are literally connected to the experience, know what to expect, know how to behave, and are ready to go. Let me stop there and call on Celia. Celia, any questions in the Q&A box so far about setting expectations?
Yes, let's see. Anthony just asked a question. Anthony says, we run community meetings and workshops often around dinner or lunch and found that a web meeting or webinar drops the networking aspect of in-person meetings. We've been experimenting with a pre-meeting networking chat for those that get there early to get folks talking and chatting before the start of the program. Any other suggestions for activating the audience and having networking connections?
Thank you for bringing that up. That's a big issue that we're hearing a lot about. How do you create a sense of community when you have lots of people coming together and they maybe can't see and hear each other? So a couple of things to keep in mind. I love the idea of sort of a pre-meeting chat. If you have people, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but if you have the ability for them to turn on their videos at the beginning, sort of pre-meeting, so people can see each other and say hi, ask questions in the chat box that they can answer, do polls or surveys. Yeah, there's a lot of different things you can do up front. So keep listening. And as we get to part 3, when we talk about keeping people active, consider that some tips for things you can do up front to create that sense of community. But thank you so much for bringing up that point. That's really a challenge. How do you create community in this environment when it's so absent? And with that, let's save other questions because we're falling behind. We need to move on. But again, we'll have after class time if we don't get to your question. Let's talk about keeping it personal. And that gets to the question you just asked. This is an impersonal medium. I can't see you. I guess you can see me, but I can't see you. I can't hear you. We're all sitting, staring at a computer somewhere. So how do we cut through the impersonality? Well, as I just said, if you have video for the participants, if the individual's video streams can be turned on, that can be very useful. Now, particularly for smaller groups. With large groups, it can be unworkable. With smaller groups, videos can be useful, but you need to use it wisely. So here's what we recommend. In a pre-meeting chat or at the very beginning when people are signing on, have them turn on their videos so you can see them and you can say, hi, Jim, hi, Gwen, nice to see you again. And people can check in. But once you get into the substance of the meeting or the training, we tell people to turn the videos off. That serves a lot of different purposes. For the speaker, for someone like me, it's distracting to see a lot of video streams on screen, to see people getting up and walking away, the cat walking across the keyboard, stuff like that. So it doesn't really help me to see all that while I'm trying to focus on the material. And for the participants, seeing lots of different people can also be distracting. I realize it can create a sense of community, here we all are, but more often than not, it can be distracting. Or for the participants themselves, they can feel like, I don't like being under a microscope, or I have to stay within the frame so I can't get comfortable like this. And then when you get back to something like Q&A or discussion, which is all about people speaking up, then I think you can turn them back on. Go into gallery view and let's see everybody, and then people can have a discussion. We're not the only ones saying this. Take a look at what the Wall Street Journal wrote back on April 3rd. And they're not the only ones saying it. Look what Fast Company said on April 15th. And you can go even all the way across the Atlantic to the BBC and look what they say. So consider those options available to you. Now, if you don't have video, either because your platform doesn't accommodate it or by working from home, you're dealing with slow internet speeds and it would just slow the whole thing down to have all these video streams on, you can compensate for that with small groups by creating slides for the participants. If we could not have a video for Monica Kelly, for example, we might have a slide like this. So if I were to call on her or she would speak up, we could bring the slide up on the screen and at least we could see who's speaking. Just adds a little more of a personal touch. And you certainly want to do that for your speakers if they cannot be seen in video. A few years ago, we did a webinar for the Communications Network. This was long enough ago that there was no video. So when they were speaking, we had the Lisas in this picture on screen. Encore.org did a webinar for Northwestern with 4 speakers. They had this on screen as all 4 were introduced. And then as any one speaker came to the fore, like for example, Anita Cruz, they would have a slide like this up on screen when she started speaking. So at least you can see who's talking. Another way of treating this, NSTA did a webinar co-hosted by Scott Denning and Randy Russell. When Scott was speaking and his slides were on screen, each slide had a little still thumbnail photo of Scott in the upper right-hand corner, the moral equivalent of the speaker's video box. And the same thing when Randy was speaking. If you want to do this, if you want to show who's speaking, you need to prepare in advance. What you're seeing on screen now is a picture of my webinar workstation when I used to use a video conferencing platform called ReadyTalk. Now with that platform, you can see the large slide on the screen, that's what everyone's seeing. The slides along the bottom, that's what's before or after in my PowerPoint deck. But taped to the workstation is a list of the people in the class and the numbers of their slides within my PowerPoint deck. So let me blow that up for you. So you see there, like Dave Anderson, he's slide number 23. So if Dave were to start speaking, I would go to my keyboard and I would hit his number 2, 3, and then press enter, and boom, Dave comes up on the screen. And then I just press the number of the slide I used to be on, and boom, we're right back where we were. Watch your language. Here's a tip that comes to us from the world of talk radio. I worked in talk radio many years ago, not as an on-air talent. I was just a producer, the guy behind the glass. But I learned something there that I think is applicable here. How you talk to the audience also affects how they feel connected, how personal the whole thing feels. Here's 2 ways of addressing the audience. Good morning, everybody. Glad you could all join us today. Or good morning. Glad you could join us today. Well, what's the difference besides a few words here or there? Well, you might think instinctively, good morning, everybody. Glad you could all join us today is more inclusive. You're talking to the whole group. But one of the things they teach you in radio is that people don't listen to you as a group. They are in their car, in their kitchen, in their home, in their office. They're by themselves. So if you speak to them like this, good morning. Glad you could join us today. Or more appropriately, good afternoon. Glad you could join us today. You feel more spoken to. And that's one of the things we want in webinars. We want people to feel like we are speaking directly to them, not to remind them that there's a big audience out there that they can't see. Because if you say, good morning, everybody, glad you could all join us today, you might have the reaction this guy has. Everybody, y'all, just me here. Another technique is to limit class or meeting size. At the Goodman Center, we limit our webinars normally to 25 people because in the course of an hour, we want to reach out and touch every person and make sure every person feels that they can be heard. With very large groups, and today being an exception, but with very large groups, people may feel like they're kind of lost in the sauce. They're in that big lecture hall sitting in the back and the professor never saw them. So these are all just techniques to keep it personal, to make people feel like they're there and you're speaking to them and they feel connected in this otherwise impersonal environment. And with that, let's go back to the chat box, the Q&A box. Celia, any questions about this issue of keeping it personal?
Yes. Andrew asks, any suggestions about how to deal with questions that come at the wrong time or would move the discussion to something tangential?
Yeah, I think that when you get people who are off topic, you can handle a couple of ways. You can say, my favorite way is simply to say, that's a good question. We are either going to cover that later, or we hadn't intended on covering that, but if you'll stick around for after class time, we will deal with that question then. That is a great safety valve for anyone who's really off topic, to let them know that you're not ignoring their question, but you're going to push it outside the bounds of the webinar for which it was not appropriate anyway. So say that you'll meet them in after class time, and offer after class time if you can. One more quick question, Celia?
Yes. Tracy asks, how do you balance the reality that participants find being on camera so exhausting with the need to keep them engaged? We're not used to being so accessible. Even in a meeting when we're in person, we don't feel so on display. People are getting zoomed out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why I do believe that you should give people the option of whether they want to have their video streams on or not. But definitely during the webinar, tell people, we'll turn them on in the beginning so you can check in if you like. You don't have to. When we get into the guts of the presentation, we want people to turn them off so that you're focused on the presentation and not looking at other people or yourself. People tend to do that. They tend to stare at themselves. And take the pressure off them. The more I'm reading about how people are learning from this process, the more I'm finding that having video streams on the entire time is not a net positive in most cases. So give people that option to not show it, or to show it when they, in those specified times when it makes sense. All right, let's move on to what I think is really sort of the most challenging, but maybe the most important part, which is how do you keep people active? How do you keep them doing something that makes sense to keep them engaged in your webinar? And the first few minutes are critical. One thing we like to do at the Goodman Center is we know that some people are going to be late. So for the people who show up on time, rather than just have them sit for a minute or two, we like to have slides that we call points to ponder while we wait for everyone to log on. So when we do our webinar called Meetings for People Who Hate Meetings, and these are in-person meetings, we'll have some factoids, some quotes, some things up front for people to read for the on-timers. This is basically bonus content. We haven't actually begun the hard content of the webinar. Because if you don't do this, if you say, hey, thanks for showing up on time, we've got some laggards, it'll be another minute or two, then really the first message you've sent to the on-timers is, let the multitasking begin. Go check your email or do something else while we're killing time. And why would you want to start with that attitude? If you don't want to show slides, that may be an opportunity to do your go-rounds, your chats, the things that build community and make people feel included, to fire off a few polls, things that just get people talking, like asking questions like, who's here today? What do you hope to learn, et cetera, et cetera. But give them something to do right from the official starting time. Once you get into the webinar, look for ways to ask questions. What I mean by this is, you may have great, valuable information to present, but don't always just present the information. Sometimes turn it around and make people, work for it a little bit. Here's an example from a webinar we did about design principles. And this was about designing web pages to make people, to put stuff where people are looking the first time they get there. If you look at the research by Jacob Nielsen, one of the gurus of web usability and others, when people tend to look at a web page for the first time, according to actual heat mapping studies, which study where their eyes are looking, people tend to scan a web page in this F-shaped pattern, okay? Now, if you design web pages, this is useful information. But the way it's presented here, it's just sort of, take it in, hopefully you learn and go off and do better next time. But what if instead, when we got to this portion of the webinar, we did it as a pop quiz. And we said, according to eye tracking studies, your eyes are most likely to follow which pattern? And you called on somebody. Celia, what do you think? Monica, what do you think? And have them choose one and defend their choice. Now you have people thinking critically, looking at this and making their own decisions before you actually get to the information. So look for ways to turn it around. I'll show you another example. Here's a webinar that talks about the distinctions between managing and leading. The 5 bullets on the left, that's managing. The 5 bullets on the right, that's leading. That's the distinction we want to make. But again, here's all the information. Just take it in, learn, do better next time, right? Well, what if instead they had taken these 10 bullets and listed them like this? And now they start calling on people. Keeping things running smoothly. Mayor, is that managing or leading? Masters their context. Betsy, is that managing or leading? And you could call on 10 different people, have 10 different voices spicing up your webinar. And again, the whole audience is having to think, actively and participate, not just be fed information. Polling is another nice tool. Zoom is very easy to use polls. We could have started today with a poll, for example, let me blow it up for you, where we ask this question: how often do you participate in webinars? Check 1, we share the results, you see where you stack up to other people, and off we go. Also assigning pre-work, that's something we like to do. When we do our webinar, Why Bad Presentations Happen to Good Causes, that book I showed you earlier, we tell people, when you, come to the webinar 2 days from now or whenever, we're going to share results from a national survey in which 2,500 people like you answered questions about presentations, what they liked, what they didn't. So before you come to the webinar, we're going to send you a short form of the survey, 1-pager, take 10 minutes, fill it out, bring it to the webinar, and then see how you stack up compared to the national survey. So hopefully a little pre-work can, creates a little interest, a little momentum coming into the webinar. We like to stop and take questions frequently, as you see here. We're stopping at the end of every section. If you stop at the end of every hour, it's a long time to go where people have to hold on to their questions, or they may forget their questions, or they may put it in the chat box and you can't find the question. So stop periodically, send a visual signal for those people who aren't paying full attention, or you might even send a visual signal that puts the instructions back on the screen. Here's how you ask a question. If you have a large group like today, please, I think you should do what we're doing now, what Celia and I are doing. Have a second person who's monitoring the Q&A box or the chat box. As the presenter, it's very hard for me to concentrate on the material and give you my all, while I also have one eye tracking questions that are streaming by in a Q&A box. So I'm not even seeing it. Celia's keeping an eye on it to make sure that your questions are relayed, or to take similar questions and to chunk them together, and maybe now we'll answer 5 people at the same time. When you get to Q&A and you say any questions, and sometimes you get that deadly silence back, have a few questions to throw out at the audience. Many people ask this. Have you ever wondered that? That might spark some people to ask questions. Or you can even plant them. You can call people in advance and say, hey, Mayor, when we get to section 3, if nobody asks it, would you ask this question? Because it's a common question. And if they hear you asking it, maybe more people will pipe up. So again, these are all techniques to get people active from the start to the finish and make sure that they're engaged and participating. And let me stop again and ask Celia. Celia, any questions or comments in the Q&A box about keeping them active?
There was a question from Beth about there being a cutoff time for late attendees, but it looks like Anthony answered that. One question that we get a lot is people want to call on their participants, but they're afraid to embarrass them. What do you say to that? Yeah,
I think that, well, there are a couple of things. Depending on the number of participants, when we do webinars at the Goodman Center, like I said, these are classes of like 25 or 30. We will send an email out in advance that says our classes are very interactive. We like to call on people. If that's not your style of participation, if you really like to just sit and reflect, and not be called on, please let us know in advance. So we will do that. The other thing that you can do is to call on people in a way that's non-threatening. If I ask you, we did a survey, what do you think the result was? I'm not expecting you to know. I'm interested in your guess. Or if I ask you to give me an opinion, what do you think about this? Is this something you like or don't like? It's a chance for people to speak up where they're not going to be wrong, because they're either guessing or they're expressing an opinion. It's not asking them a hard question of fact that they can just, flat get wrong. So I think that those are two techniques. Ask them in advance if it's okay, or ask questions in a non-threatening way. Let's move on to part 4 and talk about using your assets, because this is an asset-based approach to webinars. And I think you have 2 major categories of assets. You have your visuals, what people are looking at, the slides, the videos, etc. And you have what they hear, your voice, other voices. How do you make the most of both? Well, let's start with your voice. And something you have to overcome is what we call the radio factor. Now, this is something else I learned from my days in radio. Excuse me. Now, they say when you go on TV, that television adds 10 pounds. Have you ever heard that? That's why people go on TV have to be so skinny, because it sort of, widens them a little bit. So television's got a little bit of an addition problem. Well, with radio, you have a subtraction problem. That when you go on the radio, speak through a microphone, like I'm speaking through now, or a computer mic, which is worse, or a telephone, which is even worse, you lose 10 to 20% of the clarity and the clear meaning of what you're saying. That's because two different things are happening here. One is technical. There's compression on your voice. You're losing some of the high end and the low end, so you tend to get more of the middle range, which can make you sound more monotonal and not as interesting and clear to listen to. Also, if people can't see you, or you're confined to a little video box, they may not pick up those facial cues, which tell you when you're being sarcastic or being serious or what have you. Listening to somebody in a webinar, it's kind of like reading a text. It's like, was that sarcastic, or did they mean that? So if yours is going to be the dominant voice over the course of an hour, you have to put a little bit more into your delivery to make sure that people hear you clearly and truly understand what you're saying. So let's do a little exercise to illustrate this. We'll talk about overcoming the radio factor. And let me ask our host, Mayor Schulman, if she could unmute and come back. Mayor, are you there?
I'm here, Andy.
Thank you. All right, Mayor. Here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like Mayor and everyone to read this text to yourselves now, okay? And then Mayor and I are going to do a little demonstration. So take a moment and read this to yourselves. All right, Mayor, you've had a chance to read this. Now, here's what I'd like you to do. I'm turning the webinar over to you. You are now going to teach the audience about the radio factor and overcoming it. And I'd like you to, we'll pretend that what you see on the screen here, they can't see. We'll pretend that nobody has seen this. This is your script, and I want you to read this aloud to the audience to teach them about the radio factor. But the first time you read it through, we'll do this twice. The first time you read it through, I'd like you to read it in your normal speaking voice. Don't do anything out of the ordinary. Just read it to us like you would as if we hadn't been talking about this at all. And let's hear what that sounds like, and then we'll try something else. So take a deep breath, and everyone, let's listen for Mayor Schulman, take one.
In radio, they teach announcers to really emphasize or punch keywords because the audience doesn't have visual cues to help them understand, and because the higher and lower ends of the audio may be lost in the transmission. The telephone can be even worse, so what may feel like overemphasizing to you will actually sound normal to the listeners.
All right. So that's your normal speaking voice, which is fine. But as I said, we have this issue of compression, not seeing you, etc. So I want you to do it again. And this time I want you to do what the text is telling us to do. I want you to punch the key words. I want you to really overemphasize so that we really understand what you're saying. And basically, I'm asking you to overact by like 15 to 20% to the point that you might feel a little bit silly where you are, hoping like nobody's going to walk in and see you. But I think it's going to be better. And for everyone else who's logged in today and joined us, listen to Mayor, and then I want you to vote in your Q&A box. Would you rather hear Mayor take one or take two? Just write take one or take two based on what you hear, and we'll see how the audience votes. So Mayor, take a deep breath. Let's try it again, this time with urgency and enthusiasm. And let's hear take two.
In radio, they teach announcers to really emphasize or punch keywords because the audience doesn't have visual cues to help them understand, and because the higher and lower ends of the audio may be lost in the transmission. The telephone can be even worse. So what may feel like overemphasizing to you will actually sound normal to the listeners.
Now, I don't want to bias our audience, but I love that. I thought you sounded great. You sound a little bit like this is your operator, Judy. Mayor, let me ask you, first of all, did that feel a little weird for you?
Definitely so.
I'm sure it did. But Celia, let me ask the important question. Who would the audience rather listen to?
Take two, unsurprisingly.
Yeah, unsurprisingly. I think it's probably unanimous. Thank you, Mayor. One way you can achieve this, everyone. See, I'm inviting my own role, everyone. One way you can achieve this, you, the individual I'm talking to, is to consider leading meetings or hosting classes standing up. If you have a standing desk, that's great, or a setup like you see here, because your voice tends to reflect your posture. If you are standing up, you will project to the room, you can gesticulate, you will speak with greater emphasis, as opposed to being hunched over your laptop, all bent over. Your voice will reflect that too. And bring in other voices. Don't let yours be the only one. When you have other voices, it breaks up the monotony. Just hearing Celia or Mayor is just more interesting after a while. It's not me yakking at you nonstop. So that's your voices. That's what people are hearing. How about what they're seeing? Your visuals. If these are your slides, does anybody really want to look at these for an hour? Seriously. I mean, even if the information is important, it's just not interesting to look at. If these are your slides, go ahead, email them in advance. Let people print them out or put them up on their screen on a separate window. There's the information, that's fine. But all this real estate in front of you, all this screen, you can do a lot more with that to keep people interested than just having to look at those slides. Let me show you what I mean. Let's say this is one of your slides, and this is an actual presentation I worked with, somebody I coached. I asked the person, I said, are you going to go through every part of this slide? I mean, there's a lot of information there, a lot of numbers and data. They said, no, actually, it's this little portion down here. This is really the part I want to point out to them. That's the important stuff. So I said, fine, if that's the case, then why not design a slide that looks like this, where it appears that you have zoomed in on that portion, said, here's the important part, folks. And then when you get to your webinar, if you want to send them the slides as they originally were, then on the left, that's what you can send them. That's basically your handout, what they can print out or put up on their screen. But during the webinar, the slide they see is what you see on the right. That's telling them this is what we're focusing on. Here's a chance for your screen slides to amplify or build on the basic slides that you started with, and not just be a duplicate that, why do we need a duplicate in the first place? In general, you want to have as little text as possible and and use images, inspiring images. If you're talking about your vision, which should inspire people, and you're educators for fair consideration, a few words on a white background, it's just not that great. But if you have wonderful pictures in your presentation like this, then you can put the same words on top of the picture, and hopefully you have a little bit of an emotional content here. In general, the less text, the better. Get rid of the stuff that doesn't have to be there. It's just noise. If you have citations, footnotes, other types of annotations, take them off your slides. That slide is not the document. It's just a slide, right? Just to be looked at. Put it in the chat box if you want it contemporaneous, or send them a bibliography afterwards with all your citations or footnotes, but have as little text on the slide as you can. Unless you want them to read text, in which case you can do this. And this is an immutable law of presenting, whether you're in person or online. If you put text up on a screen, people will want to read it. So if you're reading it to them, you're annoying them. If you're talking while they're reading it, you're annoying them. So if you want them to read it, let them hear it in that little voice inside their head, which just happens to be their favorite voice. And if you have video of yourself or other panelists, etc., or the participants, make sure that they're using it in the best possible way. There are lots of common potholes that people are stepping in out there. For example, bad lighting, having too much light behind them, and the person who's talking is in darkness. Or they haven't bothered to frame themselves properly. I'm sure you've all been through the webinar or the web meeting where the person talking, you're looking at the top of their head for 20 minutes. If you are hunched over a laptop, you can get these unflattering angles. So take a moment to make sure that you're basically looked at head on. It's even better if the camera's looking down at you a little bit. And make eye contact. If you talk to the camera, then you're talking to the person and it looks like I'm talking to you. But if you look at those video boxes, which might be on the right side of your screen like that, I feel like, okay, I'm looking at you, but you're saying, where's he looking? He's looking somewhere else. So make eye contact. Simple checklist: lighting, framing, a not too bright or distracting background, and eye contact. And even if you're that little box in the upper right-hand corner, it can make a difference. Bringing in other videos is also useful, like from YouTube or other sources. There's a video on YouTube right now called A Video Conference Call in Real Life that I think is hilarious. Don't go now, but later today you might want to look at it if you haven't seen it already. If I wanted to bring in a 30-second snippet of this, I could take that video and bring it onto a slide, maybe play it full screen so there's nothing else to distract you, or put on a black background so it has a nice frame around it, and then you get something that looks like this.
Hey, Paul. Thanks for being here on time. Paul? Hey, Paul, can you hear me?
I can't hear you.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Hey, guys.
Oh, hey, Tyler.
Sorry I'm late. Having a hard time connecting.
1 second. Paul's having a sound issue.
I can't hear you. Try adjusting your output settings.
Can you hear me?
It's the gear icon.
Tyler, are you on hotel Wi-Fi?
Yeah, why?
Yeah, it devolves from there. But video is a good way of sort of breaking up the monotony, giving people a chance to sit back and listen, giving you a chance to catch your breath. There's a lot more to be said about good visuals, more than we have time for here. So let me refer you to some good resources. Presentation Zen, designed by Gar Reynolds. He has several books about designing slides. This is one of the best. And even if you're an amateur like me, you can learn a lot about slide design there that you can try. Nancy Duarte, one of the premier designers in the country, has several books on design. Slideology is my personal favorite. And you can download our book, Why Bad Presentations Happen to Good Causes, that has a whole chapter on design for free from our website, thegoodmancenter.com. So these are all techniques to use your assets to make sure that the voices and the visuals are as good and strong as possible. And because we are running a little bit behind, I'm going to move on to our last section. So if you have questions about this, Celia will save them and she'll bring them up at the end. So let's move on to section 5, and that's keep it moving. Keep it moving, which is what I'm trying to do right here. What do we mean by keeping it moving? Well, in webinars, when people are looking at mostly slides like this, if the slide is static for too long, it can send a signal to them that, okay, I've seen it, I've read it, I've taken it all in. He's still speaking, he's still talking about it. So now we're doing radio. Now I'm just listening because I don't need to look anymore. And, with radio, multitasking is fine. So I'll just go check my email over here, right? So the more you can keep this thing moving and changing, the better in terms of constantly recueing visual interest. So 2 words, always build. Build the slide in front of people gradually so that they are seeing things change and not just have a static image like this. This slide fails in 2 ways, by the way. Not only is it all at once, but it's just visually uninteresting. We're talking about something actually visual like structure, which could be depicted schematically or through a graphic, and all we have is words on a page. So let me show you an improvement. Now when we talk about story structure, we do a little diagram for you where we show the protagonist, the person that has to start the story. And that's all you see on screen, so you're focused on that until we get to the next element and we explain what that means, and the next after that, and those in the middle, and that at the end, and we gradually build the slide for you, keeping you focused where we want you focused, controlling the flow of information. You can do this with something as mundane as a bar graph. Again, if you present this all at once, people will look at it, they'll take it in, they'll make their own decisions, and while you're moving dutifully from left to right, explaining all the bars and what they mean, people will feel, well, I've seen it, I'm going to check my email while he's catching up with me. But if instead you build the slide in front of them gradually, every time something else pops up on the screen, people will say, oh, something new happening here. And you can work your way through the slide and keep them focused where you want them focused from start to finish. Because if you don't do this, then you wind up in situations like this. In this webinar for NPlan, this slide was on screen for over 3.5 minutes while people were chatting. This slide for almost 4.5 minutes. And when they did an interview with their guest expert, Wendy Callens, this slide was on the screen for almost 16 minutes. Now, look, it may have been fascinating conversation, but when nothing's happening here, people will be tempted to Just listen and do other things, right? So how do you avoid this? Well, consider the interview with Wendy Callens. If they had called her in advance and pre-interviewed her and said, hey, Wendy, when we're talking to you about safe routes to school, what are some of the things you're going to talk about? And Wendy says, well, I'm going to talk about the walking school bus, where kids walk in 2 lines wearing yellow reflective vests with adults, kind of looks like a bus. You say, fine. You find that picture on the internet, or you get it from Wendy, and that goes up on the screen while she's talking. When she's finished talking about it, you can go back to your speaker slide. And then when she talks about another route to school, like kids biking in 2s and 3s with mom or dad, you can put a picture like that up on the screen as a backdrop, and then you go back to Wendy. You can achieve this also by interspersing speaker and participant slides. Again, if you're going to a different speaker, a different participant, something new comes up on the slide to keep people interested. Now, if you're thinking, this is a lot of work, it is. For this hour alone today, there are over 130 slides in this deck, and you've seen just about all of them. Now, I'm not saying that you have to create over 100 slides for every hour that you're on, but I am saying that if you're in a basically slide-dependent presentation, the more things are happening on screen, the more there's changing from slide to slide, interspersing speaker and participants, animations, etc., the more you can keep people focused where you want them focused. And this also requires some additional preparation. I have in front of me, you see it up on screen, here it is right here. I have every slide printed out. I have 9 slides to a page printed out, so I can jump to any slide at any time. If someone were to say, I want to take a look at that walking school bus again, I can go right to that slide and show it to you and then come back where we are. So, to keep it moving, always build. Intersperse speaker and student slides. Be prepared to jump around. And let me go to Celia now. Celia, any questions about either the last segment or this segment before we get to some final tips and signing off? Celia?
Yes, a couple of questions around students not being able to read the slides. So in terms of students that are just joining by a phone, or an audience that has difficulty with literacy, or an audience that has a seeing impairment, how do you deal with students when you know a number of them are not going to be able to read the slides for themselves?
Actually, I have an answer for that. So let me move into the final section and I'll answer that question. But first of all, so hold that thought, please. I will get to it. First of all, like some caveats before we close. Number one, stuff happens. You'll have technical problems. You'll lose your connection. Even I, the host, have been knocked off of webinars. So have, if not one plan B, several plans B, plans B, C, and D. Ask yourself, what could go wrong technically in the course of the webinar, and what will we do to compensate for it? For example, Celia, my co-host, has a copy of all the slides on her computer. If I should get knocked off, she is ready to jump in and take over. So ask yourself, what can go wrong and what will we do when it does? Also, we like to limit webinars to an hour because no matter how entertaining or well put together it is, it's still sitting and staring at a computer. And after an hour, I think most people need to get up and get the blood circulating again. So if you're going to go more than an hour, good substantial breaks between hours, 10, 15, 20 minutes, for people to get up, answer the call of nature, answer email, get some fresh air. That can make it worthwhile. Get feedback. If you start to make some changes in your webinars based on what you're learning today, and we hope you will, nothing will tell you better if they're working or not than to ask the audience, how was that for you? So when we do webinars at the Goodman Center, we always send a follow-up email saying, let us know what worked. And if you want to get even more elaborate, you can put a survey up on SurveyMonkey or some other survey tool and ask them a whole bunch of questions and get some really detailed feedback on what's working and what's not. And to that question just asked moments ago, you need to ensure accessibility. Whether you're using Zoom or Adobe GoToWebinar or Microsoft Teams or other platforms, almost all of them, I believe now, have a section about accessibility, how you can do things like closed captioning or providing slides afterwards. There's a whole bunch of things you can do, more than I can go into here, but take some time to figure out who's in the audience and what challenges they may have in absorbing your material, and make sure you plan for that. But check your platforms. There's a lot of good advice right there. Just a few, a few bits of housekeeping, and then one last thought before we go. We do want to respect your time, and we will, once again, be sticking around for after class time. If you found today helpful, useful, we do a monthly newsletter called Free Range Thinking, which is only about best practices in communications in the public interest realm in which we all work. So if you want to sign up for it, go to our website, thegoodmancenter.com, give us your email address. We'll send this to you once a month. You can see what we were writing about there in May, just what we're doing now. And we won't do anything else with your email address. In between newsletters, I tweet under the name Goodman Center if I see something very timely, a documentary you should watch, an article you should read, etc. So if you want to follow me at Goodman Center. And all through June and July, we've been rejiggering our schedule to offer classes in storytelling and presenting and strategic communications so that, if you're stuck at home, you can keep the learning going. So please check out those classes. One last thought before we go. This is where your audience lives. And if you want to speak to them where they live, you got to do a little bit more than simply putting up an agenda, putting up some slides and start talking. You've got to put more into it, particularly with all this desire, all this tendency to multitask. We've been teaching this class for over 10 years. These recommendations are battle tested. So we urge you, give some, if not all of them, a try. We are confident it will make your webinars better. And most important of all, stay safe. If necessary, stay home, stay well. Eventually, we're going to be on the other side of this thing, and we need you then. So we hope you take good care of yourselves. And if you want to, as a closing thought, if you want to see what it's going to look like when we get to the other side of the quarantine or the lockdowns, I think it's going to look something like this. Thank you very much to Mayor, Monica, Betsy, and everyone at the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving and the Nonprofit Support Program in particular. A little bit later today, you'll be getting a link to the recording, the key slides, and the report, dialing in, logging on, nodding off. That concludes today's webinar. If you can stick around for after class time, we're happy to answer any of the questions we didn't get to. Otherwise, have a great rest of the day and a great rest of the week. Thank you, everyone. And Celia, any additional questions, comments, or other business we did not get to for after class time?
Yes, there are a number of questions. The first one that popped up was from Jennifer. She said, if you're hosting a webinar where some people might be joining by phone, how do you give them a chance to participate? They can't use the chat or Q&A, so you would have to unmute them in order to hear them. Is that what you would do?
I guess I have to give you the all-purpose, never satisfying answer of it depends. If I have a relatively small group, and again, when I say relatively small, I'm talking 25, 20 or fewer, and I know some people are on the phone, then I think you could take the time to stop and say, for those on the phone, let's unmute and let's hear your questions. With very large groups, it becomes a little bit more cumbersome to do something like that. So I think that by sending your slides in advance or afterwards, by making a promise of a recording available to people, you're taking the people who can't be there for the live event and giving them fallbacks. You don't want to do too many things that take time and are cumbersome, so that while 95% of your audience can see it and only 5 or 10% can't. So with smaller groups, yeah, try and stop down and take those questions. With larger groups, let the people who are just by phone know that we're going to take care of you, just not simultaneously. We're going to get you before or after.
A few questions around reading from a script. How can I look at notes or a script while I'm making eye contact?
That is a challenge. I have, right now, I'm looking at you, trying to make eye contact. I also have some notes down here, right down there. And so every once in a while, I will glance down and see it and look up. And I think that's okay. It's very much like when you are speaking to people in person and you glance down at your notes and then look back up. I'm not a big fan of reading from scripts. When people read from scripts, they sound very canned. They lose the spontaneity. And, it's just not the same. You don't feel so much you're being talked to as being talked at. So I tend to avoid script and tell people, if you don't have it all memorized, then see if you can boil it down to some key points that you can have on a card or on a script, on a piece of paper below you, so you can glance down to remember what you want to say, but then keep it in your own words. I think your audience is much more inclined to put up with a few ums and ahs and know that a human being is talking to them and is involved than someone is reading mechanically from a script.
What are your thoughts on taking joke breaks or story breaks, or what are your thoughts on the inclusion of lots of funny slides throughout the presentation?
It depends entirely on the content of the presentation. If it is appropriate, if it would not be in sharp contrast to the gravitas of what you're talking about, then yeah, stopping for something humorous. I'm a big fan, as you can see, particularly by the last video we included. I love it if you can make people laugh and lighten things up, but the overarching principle is it appropriate within the context of what you're talking about as your main topic?
If you're working with multiple presenters' content, how can you make slides interesting yet still look cohesive?
That's a good question. And what you have to do is you have to make sure that you meet with people in advance, whether virtually or not, to say, we're going to be sharing presentation duties. You're going to be presenting, so let's make sure that the handoffs are smooth. And if we're incorporating your slides, let us see your slides in advance to make sure that either we can bring them into our format so they can look consistent, or at least that they adhere to certain rules of keeping it interesting visually. If someone sends you slides that are just all dense text and graphs and charts, and you know that they're just a nightmare to look at, then you've got to work with that person and say, look, you've got good information here. We want to share it. This is not the optimal way to do it in this format. So maybe perhaps we could reformat them, or we'll provide these slides to people in advance and show something different on screen to enhance it. But spend some time. The more work you do preparing for the webinar, particularly with other presenters, the better the actual experience will be.
What about the time and expense of getting releases or licenses for all the images?
Go through it. You don't want to be stealing images. You want to make sure that any images or videos you use, you have permission to use, etc. If you can't get permission or can't afford it, then you've got to be creative in some other ways. One of the great benefits I have is that Celia is a wonderful illustrator. So a lot of the images we have are drawings of people, for example, like so. That's not something we lifted off the internet. Celia did that. So find yourself a wonderful illustrator like Celia Hoffman, and you'll be in good shape.
Thanks, Andy. Is it all right not to have the speaker on video?
Yes, I think so. I think, and that's something that we're even asking people now. Does it help to see me while I'm talking? Generally, the answer we get is yes, that people feel like seeing the human being enhances it, particularly if the video stream is strong and that there's not a, the sounds and the images are not out of sync. If the video is bad or choppy, or the visuals and the audio are out of sync, then it's a distraction. But if you're having a good solid signal, yeah, I think it can help to have that little video box in the corner. But turning it off is not that much of a problem, I don't think. I think it's close. I generally err towards using it.
Zoom only allows a certain amount of space when recording webinars on the cloud. Do you have any suggestions for how long to make recordings available?
We keep them available for a week after our classes. We think that if people haven't taken advantage after a week, then they're probably not that interested. And also, we have limited cloud space. I mean, you're right. There's only so much we can leave there. So after a week, we take them down. But Celia, actually, this is your responsibility. Is there anything else you want to say about storage on Zoom that maybe you know better than I?
No, you've pretty much said it. One thing that I will say, however, is when we want to archive classes for a long period of time, sometimes we'll upload them to YouTube and just make them unlisted or private. And that gets around needing to use the cloud storage for some of our archival videos that we want to have available periodically. Okay, I think this is the last question here.
Okay, one more.
How would you modify these tips when a webinar is recorded?
That's an interesting question. You're saying that there's no live presentation, you're just recording. You know, I think that there's, I wouldn't modify that much, because if someone's sitting and watching a recording and you're doing all these things to make it engaging, I still think that works. You know, for example, when we talked about always build the slide, if you do that for someone watching a recording, it does constantly re-cue their interest to the screen. Whereas if you have a static image, even in a recording, people will tend to look at it like radio, and they'll start to look away and do other things, and they might even miss a change. Things like, obviously, like polling and stuff like that, you can't do. But turning around and asking questions and having them try and guess, you know, leaving a moment for them to guess and then showing the answer. I think I'd say maybe 75 to 80% of this still relevant, even for recordings, because it's all about just holding people's interest, whether they're talking or not.
That's it.
All right. Thank you once again for your time and attention. Remember, those handouts will be coming to you. A very big thank you once again to the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving and the Nonprofit Support Program for making this possible. Have a great rest of the day and a great rest of the week. That concludes today's webinar. So long, everybody.